The English Channel, June 4, 1940, 1400 hours, and Generaloberst Gerd von Rundstedt stood in his field headquarters near Calais, watching through his field glasses as the last British destroyers disappeared into the morning haze, their decks crammed with evacuated soldiers from Dunkirk, while beside him Generalfeldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel studied the latest intelligence reports from Berlin, neither man yet comprehending that they had just allowed 338,000 Allied troops to escape from what should have been Germany's greatest victory, a complete annihilation that would have ended British resistance before summer's end. The smoke still rose from the burning oil tanks at Dunkirk, the acrid smell mixing with the salt air, as Wehrmacht officers celebrated what they believed was the destruction of the British Expeditionary Force, convinced that Britain would now sue for peace within days. Unaware that in London, Winston Churchill was preparing to deliver a speech that would transform their certain victory into the beginning of their ultimate defeat. The German High Command had every reason for confidence that afternoon, having just completed the most spectacular military campaign in modern history, crushing Poland in 5 weeks, Denmark in 6 hours, Norway in 2 months, Holland in 5 days, Belgium in 18 days, and France, the mighty France with its supposedly impregnable Maginot Line and the largest army in Western Europe, in just 6 weeks. General Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions had achieved what the Imperial German Army had failed to accomplish in 4 years of grinding warfare during the Great War, racing through the Ardennes in a masterpiece of operational art that had left the Allied armies reeling, confused, and ultimately trapped against the Channel coast. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated its overwhelming superiority, with Hermann Göring's pilots shooting down French and British aircraft at a ratio of 3-to-1, while Junkers Ju-87 Stukas had spread terror among retreating Allied columns, their sirens screaming as they dove to deliver their bombs with devastating accuracy. At Wehrmacht headquarters, the mood was one of complete triumph, with staff officers already discussing the occupation arrangements for London, debating whether to preserve Buckingham Palace as a future administrative centre or demolish it as a symbol of British imperialism, while others prepared lists of British intellectuals and politicians to be arrested, including Churchill himself, whom they regarded as nothing more than a drunken warmonger whose career would end in humiliation. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, reported that British morale had collapsed, that peace demonstrations were breaking out in London, that King George VI was preparing to flee to Canada, and that influential members of the British cabinet, particularly Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, were actively seeking terms through Swedish intermediaries. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, wrote in his diary that evening that the war in the West was essentially over, requiring only a formal British acknowledgement of German victory. The halt order that had allowed the British to escape from Dunkirk, issued by Hitler on May 24 and maintained for 3 crucial days despite the protests of generals like Guderian and General George Hans Reinhardt, was seen not as a mistake but as a calculated act of magnanimity, demonstrating to the British that Germany sought not their destruction but their cooperation in the new European order. Hitler himself had explained to his generals that destroying the British Empire would only benefit the Japanese and Americans, that a beaten but intact Britain would be more useful as a junior partner in German hegemony, maintaining order in its colonies while acknowledging German supremacy on the European continent. Field Marshal Hermann Göring had assured the Führer that his Luftwaffe could prevent any evacuation from Dunkirk, that the Royal Air Force was already beaten, reduced to throwing inexperienced pilots in obsolete aircraft against the might of the German air armadas. Yet even as German officers celebrated and French generals signed the instruments of their surrender, something unprecedented was happening across the Channel that would confound every German expectation and calculation. The evacuation from Dunkirk, rather than being seen as a humiliating defeat, was being transformed by British propaganda into a miracle of deliverance, with every small boat that had participated in the rescue becoming a symbol of national determination. The British Expeditionary Force, which German intelligence claimed was destroyed, was actually reforming in southern England, its men bitter at their defeat but determined to fight on, their Dunkirk experience having taught them that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Most significantly, the man the Germans had dismissed as a washed-up political adventurer, Winston Churchill, was preparing to deliver to the House of Commons a speech that would electrify not just Britain but the entire world, words that would echo through history and transform what should have been Germany's moment of final triumph into the beginning of a long, grinding war that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich. When Churchill rose to speak in the House of Commons at 3:40 that afternoon, German radio monitors in Paris and Brussels were listening, ready to report any signs of British capitulation. any hints that negotiations might begin, any acknowledgement of the new reality of German dominance. What they heard instead was something that left them first puzzled, then incredulous, and finally alarmed. Churchill began by acknowledging the obvious, that the evacuation from Dunkirk, while successful in saving the army, represented a massive military defeat, that wars were not won by evacuations, that the British had lost virtually all their tanks, vehicles, and artillery in France. German listeners nodded with satisfaction, convinced that this was the prelude to an announcement of Britain's willingness to discuss terms. But then Churchill's voice changed, taking on a tone of steel that cut through the static of the radio waves, as he declared that Britain would fight on regardless of the cost, that even if the British Isles were invaded and subjugated, the Empire would continue the fight from Canada, Australia, India, and every corner of the globe until, in God's good time, the new world with all its power and might would step forth to the rescue and liberation of the old. The German monitors looked at each other in disbelief as Churchill's voice rose to its climax, declaring, "We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." In Paris, where Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel had established temporary headquarters in the Hotel Muris, staff officers listened to the translation of Churchill's speech with mounting consternation, unable to comprehend how a beaten nation could speak with such defiance. Keitel himself dismissed it as mere rhetoric, designed for American consumption, assuring his subordinates that the British public would never support such suicidal determination once German bombers began reducing London to rubble. But younger officers, particularly those who had studied in Britain before the war, warned that Churchill's words reflected something deeper in the British character, a stubbornness that had seen them through the Spanish Armada, Napoleon's continental system, and the Kaiser's U-boats. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda who had crafted the narrative of German invincibility, immediately recognized the danger Churchill's speech represented, understanding that words could be weapons as powerful as tanks and aircraft. He ordered German radio to denounce Churchill as a warmonger prolonging British suffering for his own political aggrandizement, to emphasize that Germany sought only peace and friendship with the British people, that it was Churchill alone who stood between them and an honorable settlement. But Goebbels privately worried that Churchill had seized the propaganda initiative, transforming British defeat into a rallying cry that would resonate not just in Britain but in America, where isolationist sentiment was still strong but where Churchill's words would find eager ears among those who saw Nazi Germany as a threat to Western civilization. Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the Kriegsmarine, read the transcript of Churchill's speech with professional interest and growing concern, understanding better than most German leaders what those words about fighting on the seas and oceans truly meant. The German Navy in 1940 was a fraction of the size of the Royal Navy, with only 4 battleships against Britain's 15, no aircraft carriers against Britain's 7, and a submarine force that, while growing, was still far from the 300 U-boats that Admiral Karl Donitz insisted he needed to strangle British trade. Raeder had always been skeptical about the possibility of invading Britain, knowing that the Kriegsmarine could not guarantee safe passage for an invasion fleet across even the narrow waters of the English Channel, and Churchill's speech confirmed his worst fears, that Britain would fight with everything it had rather than accept German terms. The German army leadership, flush with victory and contemptuous of British military capabilities after the performance of the British Expeditionary Force in France, initially dismissed Churchill's defiance as the last gasps of a dying empire. General Franz Halder, chief of the General Staff of the Oberkommando des Heers, noted in his diary that Churchill's speech was theatrical nonsense that would evaporate once German forces landed on British beaches. But General Walter von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, who had witnessed British determination during the Great War, warned that invading Britain would be fundamentally different from the continental campaigns, requiring not just military superiority but the ability to sustain forces across the water against the world's most powerful navy. Hitler himself, when informed of Churchill's speech at his headquarters, displayed a curious mixture of rage and admiration, pacing back and forth while alternately denouncing Churchill as a puppet of Jewish finance capitalism and praising him as a worthy adversary who understood the historical magnitude of the moment. He ordered preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, to proceed but simultaneously instructed Joachim von Ribbentrop, his foreign minister, to explore every possible channel for a negotiated settlement, convinced that the British establishment would eventually remove Churchill once the reality of German power became undeniable. Hitler fundamentally misunderstood British politics, believing that Churchill was an aberration who had seized power through manipulation and would be overthrown once the British people realized the hopelessness of their situation. As June turned to July, German intelligence services worked frantically to assess the real impact of Churchill's speech on British morale, sending agents reports that contradicted each other wildly, some claiming that the British people were united behind Churchill's defiance, others insisting that war weariness and fear of bombing would soon lead to his downfall. The Sicherheitsdienst, the intelligence agency of the SS, reported that British factory production was increasing, that volunteers were flooding into the Home Guard, that even women and children were preparing to resist invasion. But the Abwehr, eager to tell Hitler what he wanted to hear, continued to insist that Churchill's support was shallow, that influential figures in the City of London and the aristocracy were working behind the scenes to replace him with someone more amenable to German proposals. The Luftwaffe, supremely confident after its victories in Poland, Norway, and France, began planning for the air campaign that would either force Britain to negotiate or prepare the way for invasion. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the corpulent and vainglorious chief of the Luftwaffe, boasted to Hitler that his air force would destroy the Royal Air Force in 4 weeks, that British cities would be reduced to rubble, that the British people would beg for peace rather than endure the hurricane of fire and steel that would descend upon them. Göring had never forgiven the British for their treatment of Germany after the Great War, and he relished the opportunity to repay what he saw as 20 years of humiliation. But even as Göring made his grandiose promises, some Luftwaffe officers who had studied the British defense system expressed private doubts about the coming campaign. Oberst Joseph Beppo Schmid, chief of Luftwaffe intelligence, warned that the British had developed a sophisticated radar network called Chain Home that could detect German aircraft from great distances, that the Supermarine Spitfire was equal to or better than the Messerschmitt Bf 109, that British pilots, while fewer in number, were fighting over their own territory where they could be quickly rescued if shot down. These warnings were dismissed by Göring, who insisted that German pilots, veterans of Spain, Poland, and France, would sweep aside the amateur British flyers like eagles scattering sparrows. The German pilots themselves, the young men who would have to fly across the Channel day after day to break British resistance, had mixed feelings about Churchill's speech and what it portended. Some, filled with Nazi ideology and confidence in German superiority, welcomed the opportunity to deliver the final blow to the British Empire. But others, particularly those who had faced the Royal Air Force over France and Dunkirk, knew that British pilots were skilled and determined opponents who would fight with desperate courage to defend their homeland. Major Adolf Galland, one of Germany's leading aces, noted that during the Dunkirk evacuation, British fighters had displayed a ferocity and skill that surprised German pilots accustomed to easy victories. As German forces massed along the French coast in preparation for the assault on Britain, Churchill's words seemed to take on a physical presence, embodied in the furious activity visible across the Channel through German telescopes, the anti-invasion obstacles being erected on British beaches, the fighter aircraft patrolling ceaselessly, the naval vessels that appeared and disappeared in the morning mist like gray ghosts. German soldiers, watching from the cliffs of Calais, could see the white cliffs of Dover just 21 miles away, so close that on clear days they could make out individual buildings. Yet those 21 miles of water might as well have been 1,000, protected as they were by the Royal Navy and the determination Churchill had awakened. The first phase of the German assault on Britain began on July 10, 1940, with attacks on British shipping in the English Channel, the opening moves of what would become known as the Battle of Britain. German pilots, taking off from airfields in northern France, expected to repeat their easy victories of the previous months, to brush aside the Royal Air Force and establish the air superiority necessary for invasion. What they encountered instead was organized, determined, and increasingly effective resistance, British fighters guided by radar to intercept German formations, attacking with disciplined precision before German escorts could respond. Day after day through July and early August, the Luftwaffe launched attacks against British convoys, ports, and radar stations, seeking to draw the Royal Air Force into a battle of attrition that German numerical superiority would win. But the British, following the careful strategy of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, refused to be drawn into massive battles, instead committing just enough forces to disrupt German attacks while preserving their strength for the decisive battles to come. German pilots found themselves flying 2, 3, sometimes 4 missions a day, exhaustion beginning to tell as losses mounted steadily. The turning point came on August 13th, what the Germans called Adlertag, Eagle Day, when the Luftwaffe launched its maximum effort to destroy the Royal Air Force. 1,500 German aircraft crossed the Channel in waves, targeting British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. German pilots, filled with confidence and determination, expected this to be the decisive blow that would clear the skies for invasion. But the British were ready, their radar providing early warning, their fighters positioned to intercept, their pilots fighting with the desperate courage of men defending their homes. The battles of August 13th were fierce beyond anything German pilots had experienced, British Spitfires and Hurricanes tearing into German formations with suicidal determination, pressing attacks even when outnumbered, even when damaged, even when their ammunition was exhausted. German bomber crews, accustomed to operating with impunity, found themselves under constant attack, their formations broken up, their aircraft damaged, their crews killed or wounded. By nightfall, the Luftwaffe had lost 45 aircraft, the British only 13, and while German propaganda claimed a great victory, the pilots knew better. Through the rest of August, the battle intensified, the Luftwaffe shifting its focus to British fighter airfields, seeking to destroy the Royal Air Force on the ground and in the air. German intelligence claimed that the British were down to their last reserves, that a few more days of attacks would finish them, but the intelligence was wrong, catastrophically wrong. The British were producing more fighters than they were losing, training new pilots to replace casualties, repairing damaged airfields overnight. Churchill's promise to fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air was becoming reality. The crisis came in early September when Göring, frustrated by the failure to destroy the Royal Air Force and stung by British bombing raids on Berlin, ordered the Luftwaffe to switch its attacks from military targets to London itself, convinced that terror bombing would break British morale and force Churchill from power. It was a fatal mistake, giving British fighter airfields desperately needed respite while concentrating German attacks where British defenses were strongest. The first massive raid on London came on September 7th. 300 bombers escorted by 600 fighters darkening the sky as they headed for the British capital. September 15, 1940, would become the decisive day, the moment when German hopes of a quick victory over Britain finally died. The Luftwaffe launched its greatest effort, sending wave after wave of bombers and fighters across the Channel, determined to deliver the knockout blow that would end British resistance. German pilots, exhausted from weeks of combat, flying aircraft increasingly worn from constant use, faced British defenders who seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, their tactics improving, their determination unshakable. The battle raged from dawn to dusk, the sky over southern England filled with the contrails of fighting aircraft, the sound of machine guns and cannon echoing across the countryside, parachutes drifting down as pilots from both sides abandoned damaged aircraft. German bomber formations, expecting to find weakened defenses, instead encountered more British fighters than ever before, Spitfires and Hurricanes attacking in coordinated waves, breaking up formations, shooting down bombers, forcing others to jettison their bombs and flee. By the end of that terrible day, the Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft, their burning wreckage scattered across southern England, their crews dead or captured, their confident expectations shattered against the rock of British determination. The British had lost 28 aircraft but had proven that Churchill's defiance was not mere words but reflected an iron will that would not be broken by bombing or invasion threats. German pilots, returning to their bases in France, knew that they had lost more than just aircraft and comrades. They had lost the battle for air superiority that was essential for invasion. In Berlin, the news of September 15th was received with disbelief and rage, Hitler demanding explanations for how the mighty Luftwaffe had been fought to a standstill by what he called a handful of British amateurs. Göring, his prestige shattered, blamed everyone but himself, claiming that his pilots lacked aggression, that intelligence had underestimated British strength, that the weather had favored the defenders. But the truth was simpler and more profound. Churchill's speech had not been empty rhetoric but a promise that Britain had kept, fighting on the seas and oceans, fighting with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. 2 days later, on September 17th, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, though the official reason given was the approach of autumn weather. In reality, the German High Command had finally understood what Churchill had meant on June 4, that Britain would never surrender, that even if invaded, resistance would continue from the Empire, that the war Hitler had expected to end in 1940 would continue for years. The Wehrmacht, designed for short, sharp campaigns, would now face a long war of attrition it was not prepared to fight. Admiral Raeder, meeting with Hitler on September 26, finally spoke the truth that others feared to voice, that the Kriegsmarine could not guarantee safe passage for an invasion fleet, that the Royal Navy remained intact and dangerous, that British resistance had not weakened but grown stronger since Churchill's speech. The Admiral presented figures showing that even if the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority, which now seemed impossible, the Royal Navy could still destroy an invasion fleet in the Channel, that the enterprise was doomed from the start. General Halder, who had dismissed Churchill's speech as theatrical nonsense, now wrote in his diary that the British Prime Minister had proven to be a formidable adversary who understood war not just as a military contest but as a battle of wills, and that he had succeeded in mobilizing the British people to a degree the German leadership had thought impossible. The general noted with professional admiration that Churchill had transformed a military disaster at Dunkirk into a moral victory that had strengthened rather than weakened British resolve. Even Goebbels, the master propagandist, privately admitted that Churchill had outmaneuvered him, that the British leader's speeches had created a narrative of heroic resistance that resonated not just in Britain but around the world, particularly in the United States where American opinion was slowly shifting from isolationism to support for Britain. The propaganda minister noted that every German attack on London only seemed to strengthen Churchill's position, making him a symbol of defiance against Nazi aggression. The U-boat war that Admiral Dönitz had advocated as the alternative to invasion began in earnest, German submarines seeking to strangle Britain by sinking the merchant ships that brought food and materials across the Atlantic. But even here, Churchill's determination proved decisive, the British accepting rationing and hardship rather than surrender, while the Royal Navy and Royal Air Force gradually developed tactics and technologies to combat the submarine menace. The convoy system, improved sonar, long-range aircraft, and above all the determination to keep the sea lanes open regardless of losses, eventually defeated the U-boat threat. In North Africa, where Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps initially achieved spectacular successes against British forces, the pattern repeated itself, early German victories giving way to stubborn British resistance and eventual defeat. Rommel himself, despite his tactical brilliance, came to respect British determination, noting that they fought with particular ferocity when defending prepared positions, that they never gave up even when surrounded, that Churchill's spirit seemed to animate even the lowest British soldier. As 1940 turned to 1941, and America gradually moved toward entering the war, German leaders could only reflect bitterly on how different things might have been if Churchill had not given his speech on June 4, if British morale had collapsed as expected, if the island nation had accepted the generous peace terms Hitler claimed he would have offered. Instead, Churchill's words had transformed what should have been Germany's greatest triumph into the beginning of a two-front war that would ultimately destroy the Third Reich. Hitler himself, in his bunker in 1945 as Soviet armies closed in on Berlin, would reportedly say that his greatest mistake was not destroying the British forces at Dunkirk when he had the chance, that allowing them to escape had given Churchill the opportunity to rally British resistance. But even this was a misunderstanding of what had really happened. It was not the escape from Dunkirk that had saved Britain, but Churchill's ability to transform that escape into a symbol of determination that would not be broken. The German generals who had dismissed Churchill's defiance in June 1940 lived to see their armies destroyed, their cities reduced to rubble, their nation divided and occupied. Many of them, in their post-war memoirs, would acknowledge that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of British resistance, that they had assumed a nation that had suffered such a defeat as Dunkirk would seek terms, not realizing that Churchill had tapped into something deeper in the British character, a stubbornness that grew stronger under pressure. The Luftwaffe pilots who had lost 56 aircraft on September 15, 1940, had experienced firsthand what Churchill meant when he promised to fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. They had learned that words could be as powerful as weapons, that a leader who could inspire his people to fight against overwhelming odds was more dangerous than any military advantage. They had discovered that the British, far from being the decadent empire of German propaganda, were capable of extraordinary courage and determination when their survival was at stake. The story of how Wehrmacht generals dismissed Churchill's defiance only to see their certainty of victory transformed into ultimate defeat is more than just military history. It is a testament to the power of leadership and the importance of morale in warfare. Churchill understood what the German leadership did not, that wars are won not just by tanks and aircraft but by the will to continue fighting when defeat seems certain, by the ability to inspire hope when situations appear hopeless. The German High Command had calculated everything except the one factor that would prove decisive: the refusal of the British people, inspired by Churchill's words, to accept defeat. They had measured British military weakness but not British moral strength. They had counted British losses but not British determination. They had assumed that rational calculation would lead to British surrender, not understanding that Churchill had moved the conflict beyond rational calculation into the realm of existential struggle. The 56 planes lost on September 15, 1940, were more than just aircraft. They were the physical manifestation of German assumptions crashing against British reality. Each burning Heinkel or Messerschmitt represented another German certainty proven wrong, another calculation invalidated by British determination. The pilots who died or were captured that day were victims not just of British fighters but of their leadership's fundamental misunderstanding of what they were fighting against. The transformation from German triumph in June 1940 to German defeat in September 1940 was not just a military reversal but a psychological one. The Wehrmacht had conquered nations through a combination of military superiority and psychological warfare, breaking the will to resist before battles were even fought. But in Churchill, they encountered an opponent who understood psychological warfare better than they did, who could take military defeat and transform it into moral victory, who could inspire resistance when resistance seemed impossible. Looking back from the perspective of total German defeat in 1945, it is clear that Churchill's speech on June 4, 1940, was one of the turning points of the Second World War. It marked the moment when British resistance crystallized, when vague determination became iron will, when a nation that should have sought terms instead chose to fight on alone against what seemed like overwhelming odds. The Wehrmacht generals who dismissed that speech as meaningless rhetoric learned through bitter experience that words could change history. The legacy of that dismissal would haunt German military planning throughout the war, the assumption that enemies would behave rationally, that they would surrender when faced with superior force, that they would choose survival over resistance. Again and again, from the Soviet Union's refusal to collapse in 1941 to America's determination to fight across the Pacific, German leaders would discover that their enemies possessed the same quality Churchill had awakened in Britain: the will to fight on regardless of cost. The German officers who stood on the French coast in June 1940, watching the last British ships disappear into the Channel mist, had thought they were witnessing the end of British power. They had believed that Churchill's defiant words were the last gasps of a dying empire, not understanding that they were actually hearing the opening notes of a symphony of resistance that would crescendo into their own destruction. They had dismissed those words, and in dismissing them had sealed their own fate. The Battle of Britain was more than just an air campaign. It was the physical manifestation of Churchill's promise to fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. Every Spitfire that rose to meet German bombers, every pilot who climbed into his cockpit knowing he might not return, every mechanic who worked through the night to repair damaged aircraft, was part of Churchill's answer to German aggression. The 56 planes lost on September 15th were the price Germany paid for underestimating British resolve. In the end, the Wehrmacht generals who had dismissed Churchill's defiance learned the hardest lesson of warfare: that the will to resist can overcome material disadvantage, that determination can defeat calculation, that a people fighting for their survival will find strength they did not know they possessed. Churchill had promised that Britain would never surrender, and despite everything Germany could throw at them, bombing, submarine warfare, threats of invasion, the British kept that promise. The transformation from the triumph of June 1940 to the defeat of September 1940 was complete. What had begun with German generals dismissing Churchill's words as empty rhetoric ended with those same generals realizing that those words had changed everything. The 56 planes lost on September 15th were not just casualties of war but symbols of a fundamental German miscalculation that would ultimately lead to the destruction of the Third Reich and the end of Hitler's dreams of a thousand-year empire. The story serves as a permanent reminder that in warfare, as in life, the greatest danger comes not from what we face but from what we dismiss, not from what we fear but from what we underestimate. The Wehrmacht generals who dismissed Churchill's defiance in June 1940 thought they understood power, But Churchill taught them that true power comes not from tanks and aircraft but from the human spirit refusing to accept defeat. That lesson, learned at the cost of 56 planes on one September day, would ultimately cost Germany everything. As the sun set on September 15, 1940, German pilots who had survived the day's fighting sat in their messes in northern France, exhausted, demoralized, knowing that something fundamental had changed. The easy victories were over. The British were not going to surrender. Churchill's promise to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets, in the hills, was not empty rhetoric but a declaration of intent that the British people had embraced. The war that Germany had expected to win in 1940 would continue for 5 more terrible years, and when it ended, it would be with Germany's complete defeat and the vindication of Churchill's defiance. The Wehrmacht generals who had stood so confidently on the French coast in June 1940, dismissing Churchill's words as meaningless, lived to see those words become reality. They watched as British and American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in 1944, fought in the fields and streets of France, Belgium, and Germany itself, advanced through the hills toward Berlin. They discovered that Churchill's promise to never surrender had been not a boast but a prophecy, one that they had dismissed to their eternal regret and ultimate destruction.